Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
None but ourselves can free our minds. Hello, Daniel.
Hello, and welcome to Land of the Giants. And this is going to be the first of hopefully many episodes on Nietzsche. And we're going to talk about Beyond Good and Evil. And I'm really glad that you suggested that we talk about this and that I reread it because I had a great time and I appreciated the book a lot more than I did the first time. So I guess I'll just talk a little bit about my experience, and then you can talk about yours because we had very different experiences with Nietzsche. So to me, like I would say that much of what Nietzsche believed is not controversial today. Um, I, I I guess I would say there's still a lot left that I think needs to be mined. So I want to retract that and say that m much of what is well known about what Nietzsche believed is not controversial today, and I didn't really have trouble with Nietzsche's ideas when I first read him because to me a lot of it seemed quite quite natural, and I didn't really understand why he writes the way he does, because he kind of writes like a crazy person, like a little. He seems kind of like like somebody you would meet in an alleyway who would start rambling about the end of the world or something. That's kind of what his writing style is like. But after I read it again, I actually recognized a style that I think is similar to what I'm trying to do with some of my videos on Bitcoin stuff. Because when Nietzsche was writing, he was trying to get through to highly mind controlled people, and uh, he had he had his way of thinking about the world that he had gradually developed over his life, and he had learned that the people around him would prefer to dismiss him or gaslight him even than to engage with his ideas. So I think a lot of the reason the books have kind of a strange meandering style that I think is deliberately obscure is to be somebody who cannot easily be dismissed by the people, the avatars of the ideas that are currently in power.
I think,
And if
go ahead.
I'm almost done. I was just going to say, if he had just outright stated what he thought in a clear way, he would have been easy to dismiss. But if he's a little bit obscure, that makes people want to argue about him a little bit more.
So I think you're absolutely correct in the sense historically, I think Nietzsche knew that, and he then went on to experience anyway. But I think he knew that if he put his thoughts down in that kind of clarity, which I think his earliest works are an attempt to do, he ran the risk of simply being ignored. And that I think a lot of the literary quest, right, in his style, both on a baseline level of sentences through to the way in which the books are kind of mashups of different styles. You've got maxims, you've got prose, you've got the first person pronoun present in a way that for sure for modern readers strikes as very familiar, not particularly revolutionary or problematic. But if you read Nietzsche from the other direction, if you start off with, for example, the canon that he would have read, not only the old works, but what was contemporarily early 19th century, post Enlightenment, pre industrial, semi industrial, you can see how much of a work of art, a conscious creative exercise, the vehicle for the ideas were. And that for sure, some of that was a way to try to gain attention, engagement, Uh, and I suppose it's always better to be argued with than simply ignored. Um, Back to some of the things that you said at the beginning, the effect for modern readers, I think, of some of the thunderclap insights and critiques of Christianity in particular, or um, continuing the Enlightenment project of superstitious religions, yeah, strikes as kind of, yeah, well, that's obvious. Um, but I think that his critique of authority systems of thought, Christianity being the most obvious, the most prevalent at his time, and I would argue still with us, absolutely, because we are none of us as secularized or post-Christian as we think, even if we have nothing to do with any of the religions. There are less than 4 generations between us and Nietzsche's time, where Christianity was absolutely in the fabric of everything. He has critiques about how we create metaphysics or systems of metaphysics, or another way of thinking about that are systems that we think participate in truths outside of ourselves. And therefore, our thinking is a process of accessing the true and correct metaphysics. His critique of that effectively along the lines of nobody can escape their autobiography. Everything is an exercise of projection on some level of your own experience. And so to claim some kind of truth from the process of thinking about or learning about is just a false premise. That's really still very, very powerful. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to say is that, yes, Nietzsche's idea that God is dead is, out there to the extent that graffiti exists, saying, God is dead, Nietzsche. Nietzsche is dead, God. There's a kind of truth in there, because I think one of the things that Nietzsche was saying is that death and the brutal realities of life are really worth contemplating and knowing and being aware of, because otherwise you cannot know what beauty and truth and joy are. And if you cannot in your own life practice the eternal return, if you cannot not only be okay with what happened to you, has happened to you, but will that it would always happen to you, if you can't do that, then you're not in a space that is able to recognize your own greatness, because you're unwilling to look upon the depths of non-greatness. So,
I would agree with that. But you didn't tell me about your experiences reading the book, unless you don't want to, because I thought that's what we were going to start with.
I totally do. So coming back to California on the backside of Satoshi Vision, I read Nietzsche again. I went and found it in a bookshop. I'm going to guess that maybe, let's say, since the 20 years that I first read him in my early 20s, I have read that probably 7 or 8 times. And my recognition was, wow, okay, so that's my original Bible. I belong to the cult of this book. It was a really refreshing and humbling experience, because it allowed me to see really how much impact reading Nietzsche's work in my early 20s had on the way that I have now spent the last 20 years thinking in many ways. The point about a critique of truth and the problematization of currently still standard ways of thinking about what it means to be a good person, and the possibility that truth and power and greatness and beauty and goodness looked entirely different from the kind of emotional social calculus that was all around me. Certainly a source of courage, and also definitely a painful kind of epistemological, emotional place to occupy. I mean, I think Nietzsche's work is remarkable because it is so autobiographical and so abstractly intellectual, both in terms of literature as well as the kind of almost scientific insights into the nature of reality. Even though he's talking about the human experience, he's presenting ideas that find resonance later in early quantum physics, in terms of um, the shifting point of view of the observer, of um, the fact that metaphysics is itself problematic. So I definitely found myself kind of, uh, yeah, having to just kind of sign up. I think I said to you, wow, I've just discovered that I am in fact a cult member. And this is pretty close to a Bible for me.
Okay, well, uh, that's always the danger that there's always whenever there's a cult book, there's always two possible interpretations. One where you're the cult member, and one where you're the cult leader. And someone who is really trying to make a cult will try to conceal the cult leader interpretation. Whereas I think Nietzsche is deliberately trying to make it obvious. And this is also kind of what I try to do in my videos. So you have to
But that's his.
the
But I mean, I think that's an. I think honestly, that is his interpretation of what honesty is.
yeah. Well, so I was going to make a comparison between him and Ayn Rand, and clearly there's a lot of similarities between these two authors, but I think that there's an interesting contrast in that in our Ayn Rand episode, we agreed that it's better to think of Ayn Rand as a mad woman rather than a philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Ayn Rand is kind of like a crazy person who is trying to appear sane. But
Mm-hmm.
to me, Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil seems like a sane person who is trying to appear more crazy than he really is.
Right.
And I think that this is kind of part of what he knows will attract attention. So I think that he says a lot of his ideas in a really like provocative way
Right.
that emphasizes like conflict and carnage and stuff like that. But there was something I read in Prejudice of the Philosophers, which is
Mm-hmm.
chapter 1. He
Mm-hmm.
says, untruth is a condition of life.
Mm-hmm.
So what he says is that the philosophers try to pursue truth by not making any errors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like the Cartesian rationalist method. But he says all most of the modern philosophers work basically like that. So I guess Descartes would just be like the most extreme possible example.
Mm-hmm.
But he says untruth is a condition of life. And when I read that, I thought a lot about F.A. Hayek and Karl Popper and Nassim Taleb,
Mm-hmm.
who are people that I like, and none of those people seem like crazy people like Nietzsche. They all it's sort of like they were writing about a similar kind of thing, but in a time where you can just be normal and
Well, I
say
mean,
something like
I
that.
would argue that they are writing in the time that has been affected by 50 and 60 and 70 years, 100 years worth of Nietzschean ideas actually finding their way through and into. I mean, the publishing history of his works is phenomenal, right? I mean, they go from being ignored. He's like Van Gogh. They go from being ignored to, at a certain point in the early 20th century, they haven't been out of print. So
Yeah,
I think one of the things that's interesting is to reflect on how what what used to appear crazy now appears completely normal.
right. Yeah, and I think that he really is a mind opener. Um, but yeah, but he has such a powerful mind. It's easy to accidentally be a Nietzsche cult member, even though I don't think that that's really his intention.
I think it's
But
not his intention. I think, though, that one could make, and maybe I'm just trying to excuse myself, but I would make an argument that we're all Nietzschean now, okay? We're all cult members of the framework of recognizing that our truths are constructed by ourselves and that our mentality will entirely affect the way in which we live.
oh, sure. Well, let me mention something else I saw in here, because he talks about the will to power, and I think that this is something that he says in a way that's
Shh, my dog is
sort
having.
of very evocative. But if you look at it, he's saying something that is not inconsistent with lots of ideas that are current today. So
Okay.
I would say that he says that he says he is an immoralist and he believes in the will to power. But I would say that Darwinian evolution is an application of the will to power, because the entire idea is that every organism in the population is attempting to maximize its future influence on the population.
Or simply
Um,
survivability. Just start with its basic premise is to survive.
sure,
If
but
that's
but
investment. If it survives and influences, that's trading kind of vibe.
but we know that this will to power leads to cooperation and advanced societies, at least in some cases. So you can still be an immoralist and still, believe like you need a society and you want alliances. It's just that that's kind of like that's built on top of a fundamental foundation that that doesn't have the concept of alliances inherently built in.
Right. So I think one of the most important things for anybody reading or even thinking about Nietzsche and this language of will to power, and then we get into the Superman and the Übermenschen and all of those kinds of terms, right? Is that we need to think specifically about what does Nietzsche mean by morality, therefore immorality. Okay, what is that word standing for?
Oh, that's a good question, because
Right? And then the other piece of that is that if that immorality or the morality, if the moral mandate is to be self-sacrificing, if the moral mandate is to put other people's needs and feelings first, then a will to power which is exercised with regards to the self, it's a very different thing than a will to power as manifested through the impact capacity to exercise power over others. If we
right.
restrict it to a concept of power with regards to the self, and therefore the power to choose to privilege one's own desires, needs, thoughts, feelings, then we may get closer to what Nietzsche is talking about in terms of how we each individually access our superhuman. Because in order to access our superhuman, we have to be willing to put our needs first. We have to be willing to engage in ways that culturally, circa 1840, and I would argue circa 2040, are still in the water with regards to what is moral behavior. And I think that's why Ayn Rand went off on such a head trip around altruism and the problem of altruism and the problematics that come with regards to an individual creating their own most heroic life if the moral mandate is to put some other thing, person first.
Yeah, and so well, I was just going to quick say, I think the neurons in the brain is also it could be an application of the will to power, because each neuron is trying to be more influential in the brain, and that process, produces our intelligence. Um,
I think one of the, as you know, just from private chat, right? I'm personally all loving the reminder with regards to Darwinian focus on adaptability, right? As opposed to fittest or strongest or prettiest or whatever the fuck ist. It's
yeah,
adaptability framework, okay? So I'm also really into some of the things you're talking about in terms of cooperation, association, and a kind of non-mechanical Newtonian type of interpretation that goes competition is the primary framework, where in fact it may look like our largest natural systems, fungal networks in the soil connecting vegetation, or nervous system in the body through brain barrier in the brain, that these things are actually functioning with a degree of both autonomy and cooperation. And to move forward into some of the things that came out of Bitcoin Cash conference soup of ideas and thoughts and people and inputs and all the rest of it, is this notion, I think, that we have to recognize that some of the things that are labeled centralization are in fact the beneficial product of voluntary association. And that simply because we currently culturally live in a kind of experience that is filled with an awful lot of centralized control that came out of associations that were formed so many generations ago that most people have no real access to, has perhaps given us a little bit of a too black and white, unnuanced idea about how centralization happens. Because it struck me that decentralization is kind of almost the sort of Nietzschean experience of total alienation, because you are Zarathustra and you are the only person who knows how to live, and you look crazy to everyone because no one else knows how to live. So you're going to go off and sort of totally decentralize yourself. And the opposite being full-on centralization. You have no autonomy. You never ask how you're going to live. You just follow the program. So,
well, that sounds like a great topic, but I don't have anything for now. Right on that. But I want to go back to ethics, because one of the things that, so when I was talking about philosophers before and about this method of finding truth by the rationalist method, I think Nietzsche is focusing specifically, well, I should say focusing more on ethics than on other aspects of philosophy.
Virtue.
And I forgot to mention that earlier. Yeah.
Right.
And so what I think he's saying is that the people who are claiming to be discovering objective ethics in some way are merely regurgitating aspects of their programming.
Yes,
from childhood.
Metaphysics, that anytime anybody engages in a post-Sophoclean exercise of thinking that knowledge about virtue will allow you to understand what virtue is in this metaphysical context, e.g., outside of your own individual experience. So once you start down that route, you have got an intellectual framework which is effectively dishonest, because it is trying to make truth claims through a process of knowledge that actually, in fact, have nothing to do with how we actually recognize what is good, just, beautiful, any of the elements that go into a cluster of ethics. So he's calling out most of Western philosophy for being some kind of scam and not being useful.
Totally. And again, like, this viewpoint is not so is not so so unusual today, because I to me that makes me think of Richard Feynman, who is of course a very popular and well-known and well-liked figure who always just said philosophy is stupid, and he's not interested in metaphysics at all.
Right, but also if
And
you look at what he's saying about physics, he's also saying, I'm not interested in anybody who is more convinced of their theory than experimental results. So he's saying the
yeah,
same thing. He's not saying philosophy is bad, because everything that he articulates is very in a Buddhist philosophy camp. But he is calling out the same kind of um, whatever, lack of benefit or don't pay attention um, response to systems that are not open to changing their own mind, right?
yeah, that's why I like this statement, untruth is a condition of life, so much. Because yeah, you're not a good scientist if you're not willing to be proved wrong. And so you have to frame your discussion in terms of uh objective evidence that could be obtained about it, even if you're not actually doing the experiment now. That's what the discussion ultimately has to be about.
Right, right. It's remembering that you could possibly be wrong, or the flip side being you could possibly be right, and that if you,
Yeah.
mm, and I think the other thing that what you said sort of prompted me to, oh no, it's gone. So
Sorry.
no, Nietzsche, the philosophers. Oh, right. Okay, so Nietzsche can, I think, take you, I mean, particularly that section, right? Like, and you really dig in and you start thinking about, wow, if this guy is right, then uh, it's very difficult to access anything that feels like truth or reality, capital R, beyond my own perceptions. You know, it can lead to a very nihilistic place. And I think that one of the reasons why Nietzsche, a little bit like Machiavelli, okay, is still understood to be treacherous, problematic, slightly immoral, is because they are leading the mind to a place of relativism, and relativism can lead to no absolutes, which can lead to a kind of nihilism. And I think the thing I'm really trying to say here is that rereading Nietzsche this time, and probably the last one and a half times going back in my life, I can see more clearly that he is saying something positive, in the sense that he is saying you can feel truth, you can feel virtue. It does exist. It does not exist as a process of thinking and research and metaphysics, and therefore a set of rules or prescriptions.
Yeah.
I think what
So
he is
so
saying is you can feel truth through the creation of terrible things, terrible beauty, terrible intensity. That the truth of life, both human and non-human, is filled with things that are of such technicolor intensity that metaphysics and sort of thought has nothing to do with it.
so I want to read a paragraph now, and this one just jumped out at me because it's so awesome. This is paragraph 29. It says, "It is the business of the very few to be independent. It is a privilege of the strong, and whoever attempts it, even with the best right, but without being obliged to do so, proves that he is probably not only strong, but also daring beyond measure. He enters into a labyrinth. He multiplies 1,000-fold the dangers which life in and of itself already brings with it, not the least of which is that no one can see how and where he loses his way, becomes isolated, and is torn piecemeal by some minotaur of conscience. Supposing such a one comes to grief, it is so far from the comprehension of men that they neither feel it nor sympathize with it, and he cannot any longer go back. He cannot even go back again to the sympathy of men."
Yes, indeed. And he's talking about his own experience, and I suspect the experience of lots of people, which is what happens when a kind of what we call cognitive dissonance, or you start to see the world um, in a way that is different from most people, but most people don't even see you seeing the world differently. So this whole kind of existential question about if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one to hear it, does it fall? And what happens if you are the tree falling in the forest and you know that there's no one there to hear it? No, if you go back to the group of people who are like, I didn't hear anything, can you ever return? can
Yeah, yeah.
ever come back from knowing what you know, if you have a break of reality, come out of the matrix,
No,
like
I got it. I mean,
can
that's
you go
totally how I
back?
felt when I got into Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Because it's been like sheer madness ever since I got in. So I'm kind of, I mean, I'm getting a little bit used to it by now, but and yeah, nobody would listen to me. Like I would try to talk about Bitcoin with people, even with people that I thought would be interested, like libertarians or something, and it was just like face face blank, mind shut off, like.
Yeah, 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 totally. And when I say to you, like coming back to reading this book was like discovering my own, oh, right, this is my manual, and recognizing that in no kind of self promotional or egotistical way, but right, okay, this explains why for a lot of the last 20 years, I have felt a certain kind of alienation from ways of thinking that have not read Nietzsche. And so for me, that's definitely translated into some of the ways in which I think about and understand personal relationships, romantic relationships, the stuff of family and friendship, and um, what real virtue is, and the extent to which the kinds of moral prescripts that Christianity culturally has produced and Nietzsche is arguing against um, inform even the most secular ideas of things like what is a friendship and how should one conduct oneself in a friendship, and how should you think about how other people's feelings matter to you or don't matter to you, what people's obligations are to you. Because if you start to dig into this idea that if you really love yourself, you must love everything about your journey to where you are at that moment. And it extends outwards to other people. You're really going to love somebody else. You likewise have to love. It's this idea of the eternal return. You have to love all of the things that go into the autobiography of that person, including and specifically all of the things that you would feel most regret about, or you would feel most shame about, et cetera, et cetera. All of those parts of ourselves that we are continually trying to push away are part of the problem. And especially when we try to push those things in other people away from us as some kind of condition or marker of good relationship or fulfillment or whatever you kind of want to go with. So that's a very powerful and challenging and very difficult thing to do. It is very easy to say and very difficult to do. And I think that's why he talks about the heroic. Okay, I do not think that he is talking about some kind of Nazi-like late 21st century libertarian Mad Max. Is not talking about that crap. He's not talking about the capacity to will to power over others. You know, he's really talking about how difficult it is to practice the kind of practice the compassion and acceptance of yourself as a human, so as to liberate the greatest things that a human can be. And those things are not control over others; those are control over oneself and whatever one creates.
Okay, well, yeah, okay, great. Because now I wanted to quick go back to Emanuel Swedenborg. I'm really glad we talked about that book now, because now I can go back to what I said there, because what what so in Swedenborg, you choose whether to go to heaven or hell after you die.
Right.
And what I said is the Nietzschean Superman can choose to switch later on, so he can go back and forth.
Right.
And so uh like I think that uh like and in Swedenborg, hell is described as endless war and competition, and he sees it as an a largely unpleasant place, but
Mm-hmm.
I would say that he doesn't completely dislike hell,
Mm-hmm.
because he does kind of kind of bring up some appealing things about it, I think, because I think everybody is attracted to competition on some level.
Yeah,
Um,
and if like Dante, okay, we locate in hell all of our most preferred vices. Of course, hell is always going to be this kind of ambiguous place because nobody ever really wants to go there, but it's filled with all the stuff that in some way, even if it's a prohibition against, at least you get to go and hang out with all the naughty people who are always
yeah.
wanting.
Well, I can't wait to talk about Dante now. But
Right.
so the thing about staying in heaven too long is that the rules just multiply. So if I would argue that in Swedenborg's heaven, it would eventually turn into a totalitarian place because in order to keep being all nice and cooperative, people would have to keep deciding on more and more rules.
Right. So,
So
and right, suddenly it's the Republic.
yeah. So well, but it's just like what Nietzsche was saying about people trying to invent ethics with the rational method rather than
The intuitive one.
yeah. So if you're the Nietzschean Superman, there's a point where you exercise agency and
Exactly.
you say the rules are too constricting, so I am done following them. And that doesn't mean that you get a gun and you start shooting everybody or something. I mean, it could also mean that you go off and start a new business or
Right.
a different organization or you just start behaving differently.
I
And
would I
so
would argue that he would say that um, that when there are too many rules, it's a version of you have internalized too many rules, or you yourself have come up with too many rules. That it's always a self-referential exercise, and so your power is always to continue to adapt and uh, register what feels true, what does not feel true, and you can change. That the rules that
oh
you
man,
find
so
yourself
I
following.
was just going to talk about I was just going to talk about the trial again
Yeah, yeah,
because you just described the character in the trial.
exactly.
uh And so I would argue that in this book, if he ever exercised agency and just didn't show up to the trial and stopped following the rules, which he had internalized,
Yep.
then he would not he wouldn't be caught in the machine.
Right. And we can pretty much guarantee that by that point, sort of 1910, 15, Kafka would have read Nietzsche. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that Nietzsche is this permeating influence almost anywhere you turn. So, any of the physicists working in Germany or in Europe pre World War II would have read Nietzsche. Anybody doing art, Freud read Nietzsche. I mean, and here we are kind of in the 21st century talking about fake news. Okay, so the recognition of fake news or false flags, I mean, very sophisticated. You have to go through a lot of different steps to recognize that there is, first of all, not a news that's always true, that there are multiple newses, and that some of that news can be created in a way that strikes you as fake. And then there is another layer in which you know that it is not fake, but it is being presented as fake in order to get people to react to it as if it were fake. I mean, suddenly, right?
Oh man, that is such a great example because if you accept the idea that fake news is if you just accept that idea, you're already screwed up.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. So the question about how do you find your way out of the wormhole? How if you arrive at a point where it goes, okay, there is no truth, we cannot know truth, but we all have this experience of knowing that we know truth. And I think it absolutely points to what you're saying. Nietzsche's primary critique is that the idea that you can use reason or philosophy or logic or language like that to learn about virtue enough so as to find out what it is and therefore be able to create it is a false premise, because that's not how we know truth. It's not how we know goodness. It's not how we know greatness. So the idea, again, as you brought up, of the man who is trying to live a life that is organized around this perception of greatness and nobody even sees or knows it. The will to power, the part that is the will, is the part that goes, I will continue to live my life in a quest for greatness as I understand it, regardless of who sees or knows or how painful it is to feel alienated, right, from mainstream perceptions.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to quick talk about Ayn Rand again, because you made me think of Howard Rourke.
Yep.
And remember, his essential characteristic is that he wants to be creative, and he will be creative with whatever materials are available.
Yep.
So he is not willing to be a big person if he can't be creative. He's more
Right.
interested in being a small creative person than in being a big uncreative person.
Right. And that's not very far at all from what Nietzsche is saying is the heroic um, ideal. Yeah. I mean that you
Oh, and oh,
go ahead.
sorry. I just wanted to agree with you that the idea. Yeah, I mean, it's really it really seems absurd to me that the like people think that like the Nazis have something to do with Nietzsche's ideas. I mean, anybody who is a provocative, compelling thinker can be transformed into a cult leader by later generations, even if he's not trying
Completely.
to be.
Completely, but I also think that the not interpretation, misinteraction. Okay, remembering also that he wrote in German, so the power of the language that he chose is going to have had even more resonance in Germany. We can be in whatever we are, 2018, and people will read Nietzsche, and their interaction with the words will, power, superhuman will become not that dissimilar to the interpretation in the 1930s if will to power is first and foremost understood as will to power over others as opposed to will to power over self,
Sure. So
right?
so I would actually say that power, if so, what Nietzsche says is that very almost everybody maintains this slave mentality, and very few break through the controls.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones who do are the ones who are uh, uh, competing for control of the slave people. And I guess I would say that that is not inconsistent with Nietzsche to try to have power over people,
Yes,
but
I think that
what
I think that his point about how you get power over people is not the exercise of power over people. It's through the power over yourself you become powerful. No?
sure, but well, I was just going to say I think that he would prefer everybody to be power seekers, and if
Yes,
that
I
was the
agree.
case, we wouldn't have mass carnage. We would have gentlemanly competition.
Yes, right, very English. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that the problem for a Nazi-like interpretation or any other flavor of that type of interpretation that reads what he's saying as if it were a statement about the fact that there will always be a slave population. Because I think his stuff is way more hopeful. I don't think that he has dismissed everybody or created a class where, like, theoretically you can't liberate yourself. I think that's the whole purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is liberate yourself. So anybody who takes a framework that goes, well, there will always be a slave population, and the whole goal here is to acquire power over them, misses the point entirely. You know? And I think that that point about gentlemanly competition, it makes me think about what I was trying to say earlier. In order to create cooperation, you have to have autonomy. If you don't have autonomy, you don't have cooperation. So if in the language of the Bitcoin universe and a lot of the rhetoric around it, we were to substitute autonomy and cooperation for decentralized and centralized, the other way around, if we were to start using that language more, we might get a better sense of how humans can create greatest aggregate great humanness. Yeah?
Yeah, well, I certainly think an essential factor in a good group is being able to leave easily. Because if you can't, then there's no there. If you don't have to if people don't have to want to stay in, you don't have to treat them nice.
I agree. And suddenly I find myself thinking about how, I know I talked to you about this in private, where, my feeling about the chance of the success of the project of everything becoming Bitcoinized, whatever flavor Bitcoin, is dependent upon there being these ridiculously strong bridges to the fiat world. Like the idea that if you can leave, you're more likely to stay. So that
Oh, absolutely. Well,
here it is.
that's always been a difficult problem around here.
Yeah, and conceptually, it's hard for people to emotionally kind of take that on, because it's easy to see that building the bridges that go from fiat cash into crypto Bitcoin, yes, absolutely need that. But the idea that in order to further your project, you actually need to make it super easy to get out is harder to see. And it is that part about, I've talked to you about this before. Like, if you want somebody to tell you the truth, you have to make it as easy for them to tell you the truth, which means better to have no other promises be made, because you're making it super easy for them to tell you the truth. And it's likewise, if you want people to really embrace Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, crypto autonomy, you have to make it really easy for them to move back in. And actually, it makes me think about what Nietzsche's saying about you can choose to go, or Swedenborg, choice is the greatest human right I think we have. I think we could sum it
Oh
all
my
up.
God, that's so perfect lead into this is the last thing on my notes. I had one more awesome paragraph that I wanted to read. Will you hear this one? This is paragraph 41. One must subject oneself to one's own tests that one is destined for independence and command, and do so at the right time. One must not avoid one's tests, although they constitute perhaps the most dangerous game one can play, and are in the end tests made only before ourselves and before no other judge. Not to cleave to any person, be it even the dearest. Every person is a prison and also a recess. Not to cleave to a fatherland, be it even the most suffering and necessitous. It is even less difficult to detach one's heart from a victorious fatherland. Not to cleave to a sympathy, be it even for higher men, into whose peculiar torture and helplessness chance has given us an insight. Not to cleave to a science, though it tempt one with the most valuable discoveries apparently specially reserved for us. Oh, that's a good one. Not to cleave to one's own liberation, to the voluptuous distance and remoteness of the bird, which always flies further aloft in order always to see more under it, the danger of the flyer. Not to cleave to our own virtues, nor become as a whole a victim to any of our specialties, to our hospitality, for instance, which is the danger of dangers for highly developed and wealthy souls who deal prodigally, almost indifferently with themselves, and push the virtue of liberality so far that it becomes a vice. One must know how to conserve oneself, the best test of independence. And when I read that, I was like, geez, I didn't have to do any of my investor videos. I could have just read
Read
this
Nietzsche.
paragraph.
Right. So you're having the same experience I am. I'm like, wow, I've never really had an original thought in my life. Here it
Yeah.
all is. My translation here, that last sentence is, one must know how to conserve oneself, the sternest test of independence. And so, yes, I mean, also just on a small side note, listening to you read your text and mine, there are variations in translation. And so, I'm always aware of language stuff. So, yeah, Nietzsche can be better and worse translated. But I think this whole paragraph for sure is, if this were a college paper, I'd be quoting this to support my assessment that Nietzsche is really talking about oneself, and that all of this part about the will to power is about how difficult it is to exercise that power with regards to yourself. Yeah. And then the other
Oh,
thing,
absolutely.
and I think that the thing that is good in here, not to cleave to another person, though he be the one you love the most. Every person is a prison, also a nook and a corner. It made me think of Jean-Paul Sartre and his statement that hell is other people. I wanted
Oh,
to
yeah.
bring that up as a version of what hell has become. I think that for sure I know he read Nietzsche. So this part also where he talks at the end about hospitality, it is, I think, certainly in his cultural context and still today, the idea of being more concerned with the well-being of others than your own than your own well-being. And so he's not saying here, don't ever be nice to people, don't ever bring them into your house and give them food, or in a metaphorical way, allow them the space for their thinking or their this. He's not saying be a dick. What he's saying is your project is yourself. And that selfishness, which is the great moral taboo of Christianity, the great moral taboo, that selfishness,
Or any cult.
any cult, that selfishness is precisely the thing that we must regain in terms that he's laying out so as to access our own greatness. That's still pretty radical. That is still pretty radical in terms of, remembering I have two kids, which means I have an up close front seat to cultural programming as it exists right now. Right? And so even accounting for variations of, say, Bermuda or Switzerland or the United States or Japan or South Africa or whatever, certainly in anything that participates in any form of sort of westernized-ish culture, prohibition against selfishness is really profound. And yet we live and I think this is one of the things that Nietzsche is saying about how ill society is. When society tries to live in a way that is different from how they should live, and yet they can't help but try to live that way, you get kind of pathological selfishness. If you don't have proper autonomy, selfishness, then you can't get proper cooperation. So it's not surprising that you get pathological versions, because people are still going to try to do what they should want to do, but everything is structured to make it not okay to do that. And so you have to get all kind of subterfuge,
No, yeah. And somebody who is lying to themselves about being selfish is a lot worse than somebody who isn't.
Is the most dangerous to others. And I don't know, I mean, I'd have to go deep in the text, but you could possibly make a case that it is that kind of pathological orientation to the self that leads to a desire for power over others, right? Because
No, I agree with that. I mean, oh, well, I don't know. I don't know if I agree that that's what Nietzsche was saying, but I agree with you saying that.
Yeah, I think it is a bit of a natural progression, right? In as much as if for the purpose of survival, it's necessary that one maintain denial about truth, then you require other people to also not speak the truth. If you're cool with the truth, it doesn't matter what other people are doing and saying. So this exercise of controlling others, I think, is always self-referential. It's always about how do I maintain whatever degree of fiction I've got going on, in personal relationships or in nations, right? It's
Yeah,
the
well, I mean, in a controlling society, the only way to assert status is to wield power over other people, or at
yeah,
least that's an important aspect of status.
yeah, exactly. And to the ability to make the rules. And I think if we go to Anne
Well,
Rand as this attempt to kind of work out, whatever degree of success or not, but to try and work out, okay, what would the function of Nietzschean ideals look like in real people, real people, in people,
yeah, right.
or real
Yeah, I
people.
was gonna
But I
say,
mean, that's precisely the point. That's what Nietzsche is saying. That's why he's saying, look, even the attempt is heroic. Even the attempt. The likelihood of success, who knows? That's why it's superhero, to succeed in living like this. But I think that's one of the things that she's trying to work out. Um, One of the things that's striking about Rourke or Reardon is the extent to which they are uninterested in exerting control over other people. Like, they're not saying you all have to build all the buildings from now on, or run your businesses from now on the way I do. I just want you all to fuck off and let me do it my way.
yeah.
And it's the
Well,
people.
anyway, well, oh, I don't have anything else. So, do you have anything to add? Or I thought you were done, but it looked like you had more to say there.
Well, you know me, I cannot stop talking when I start. So I'm done for this part of Beyond Good and Evil. I would like to, possibly even tomorrow or later today, return to some of the maxims that are in the middle of the book. But I think that we should close up here because this has been really good.
Okay, great discussion and great book. Uh, See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.